The last ferry out of Harrow's Landing had pulled away 40 minutes ago, and Josie had watched it go from the wrong side of the dock. She stood on the weathered planks, her duffel bag at her feet, the collar of her jacket turned up against the wind coming off the lake. The kind of wind that didn't blow so much as lean, a steady wet pressure that found every gap in your clothing and settled there. The dock master's booth was dark, its padlock already frosted over. The small general store at the top of the hill had its close sign flipped, the lights off, the owner's truck gone. The lodge at the edge of town, the only place she'd seen with a vacancy sign on the drive-in, had that sign now reading no vacancy in unlit letters that somehow felt personal. Josie had $94 in her jacket pocket and a dead phone. She had driven 7 hours north of Toronto, taken the wrong highway twice, run out of data, and then run out of luck when her car slid off the gravel shoulder 4 kilometers outside of town and buried itself axle-deep in a drainage ditch. The tow truck driver who'd hauled her to Harrow's Landing had taken $80 of her money without apology. She hadn't argued. She'd learned not to argue with men who had something she needed. The dock groaned under a gust. Somewhere across the black surface of the lake, a loon called, one long, mournful note that ended without an answer. Josie pressed her back against the dock railing and looked at the town behind her. 3 streets, a church with a broken weather vane, a diner that had been closed for what looked like a season, maybe 2, and one light on, far up the hill at the end of a rutted gravel track, yellow and distant, and too far away to tell if it belonged to anyone who might actually open a door. She picked up her bag and started walking toward it anyway. The gravel track turned to mud within 50 meters. The mud pulled at her boots with a soft, sucking insistence that slowed her to half pace. The tree line pressed close on both sides. Black spruce packed so tight that the last grey light of the evening vanished almost immediately. She was navigating by the yellow window glow, keeping it in her sightline through the branches, telling herself it was closer than it felt. It wasn't. By the time she reached the clearing, the cold had moved past the inconvenient stage and into something that made her hands shake inside her pockets. The building was a log structure, low and wide, with a covered porch running the full front length and a woodshed attached to the left side. A battered half-ton truck sat in the yard, its hood dusted with the first of the evening's frost. A propane lantern hung from a hook by the front door, throwing a hard circle of white light onto the porch steps. There were no other lights on anywhere in the surrounding bush, no neighbor, no road back down she wanted to face in the dark. Josie climbed the porch steps and knocked. The sound from inside was immediate, not movement toward the door, but the sound of something being set down, heavy and deliberate. A pause that lasted long enough for her to knock a second time before the door opened. The man who filled the frame was not what she'd been bracing for. She'd been preparing for old, or for drunk, or for the particular kind of suspicious that small-town isolation produced. He was none of those things. He was somewhere in his late 30s, a decade older than her at least, with dark hair shot through with grey at the temples and a beard that had moved past, maintained into something more permanent. He was in wool socks, canvas work pants, and a thermal shirt with the sleeves pushed up. He held a hatchet in his right hand, the handle resting against his thigh, and he looked at her the way a person looks at weather, assessing, not hostile. He didn't say anything. "My car's in the ditch on the Blackwater Road," Josie said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The ferry already left. The lodge is full." She hesitated. "I don't have anywhere to go tonight." The man looked past her into the dark, then back at her face. His eyes were dark, difficult to read in the lantern light. "Come in," he said. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold. It was the same tone you'd use to tell someone the door was unlocked. She came in. The inside of the cabin was one large room with a loft above. A wood stove in the corner threw serious heat, the iron surface ticking quietly. The table he'd been working at, held a piece of split antler and a set of carving tools, which explained the hatchet. The shelves along the back wall were dense: preserves, tools, folded canvas, coils of rope. A propane cook stove against the far wall, a narrow set of stairs going up to the loft. No decoration on the walls except for a topographic map tacked flat and a single framed photograph so old it had turned amber. He set the hatchet down on the table without making a production of it and moved to the stove. "Sit," he said, nodding at the wooden bench near the heat. Josie sat. She unwound her scarf with fingers that weren't cooperating properly yet, and became aware, slowly, that she was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor in her hands and jaw that she hadn't noticed until the warmth of the room began to make itself known. The cold had been so total outside that she'd stopped registering it as something separate from herself. The man put a kettle on the stove without asking her if she wanted anything. She watched him. She watched the way he moved around the small space, economical and unhurried, like someone who had long ago stopped wasting motion on things that didn't need it. He pulled a tin mug from the shelf, a jar of loose tea, and a clean dish towel which he set on the bench beside her without comment. "Hayes," he said, his back to her. She blinked. "Sorry? My name." He didn't turn around. "In case you need to know who to tell people you stayed with." The thing about that sentence, the acknowledgement that she might have needed to protect herself by leaving a trail, hit us somewhere she hadn't expected it to. She looked at her hands in her lap. "Josie," she said. He nodded once, like that settled something, and didn't ask her last name or where she'd come from, or what she was doing on the Blackwater Road after dark in October. The tea, when he handed it to her, was black and strong and so hot it hurt to hold, but she held it anyway. The warmth moved through her palms and up her wrists, and she understood suddenly how cold she actually was. The way you only understand how bad something was once it starts to ease. Across the room, Hayes sat down at his work table and picked up a carving tool. He began working the antler again. His attention apparently returned entirely to what he'd been doing before she knocked. The scrape of steel against bone was quiet and rhythmic. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, pulling against the logs of the cabin in a low, sustained moan. "I can sleep anywhere," Josie said, more to fill the silence than because she needed him to know. "The floor is fine, loft," Hayes said without looking up. "Cots up there. Blankets in the cedar chest." "And you?" He tilted his head toward the corner, where she now noticed a narrow bunk built into the wall, half obscured by a canvas curtain. "He lived down here." The loft was extra. She didn't know what to do with that. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer. He just kept working the antler. She woke in the night to the sound of the wind doing something different. Not the steady lean of earlier, but a hammering, irregular assault that made the whole structure shudder in its footings. The cot in the loft was narrow, and the mattress was thin, but the blankets from the cedar chest were a heavy wool that weighted her down like something deliberate. And she'd slept deeply and without dreaming, which was unusual enough for her, that waking felt like surfacing from far underwater. She lay still and listened. Below her, the stove had been stoked recently. She could hear the new wood catching, the bright crackle of fresh combustion, which meant Hayes had been up, which meant he'd fed the fire while she slept in his loft. She pressed her face into the wool blanket and told herself not to make anything of it. By morning, the storm had made its intentions clear. The window at the end of the loft showed a white-out condition, snow moving sideways across the clearing, the tree line completely dissolved. The truck in the yard was buried to the running boards. The temperature had dropped overnight into the kind of cold that made the logs pop. Josie came down from the loft to find Hayes at the cook stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron pan. He was dressed, boots, heavy wool pants, canvas shirt, and had clearly been up for some time. A loaf of bread sat on the cutting board, half a dozen slices already cut. He didn't turn around when her foot hit the bottom step. "Roads'll be closed till tomorrow at least," he said. Maybe 2 days. Josie stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the window. 2 days. She had $14 left, a dead phone, and a car in a ditch. 2 days was the least of her problems, actually. She was aware, in a distant way that she'd gotten good at, that this was a situation she had no control over, and that panicking about it would not move the storm. "All right," she said. Hayes set a plate on the table. 2 eggs, 2 slices of toast, no ceremony. He took his own plate to the workbench and ate standing up, looking at the topographic map on the wall. Josie ate. The eggs were cooked in butter, the yolks still soft, the toast done in the pan. She hadn't eaten since a gas station sandwich the morning before, and the effort of eating slowly cost her something genuine. When she finished, she carried her plate to the small basin by the stove, found the dish soap and washed it. She washed his too, when he set it on the counter without comment. They moved around each other carefully that first day. The particular choreography of 2 people negotiating a small space, who don't know each other's patterns yet. She stacked the dishes wrong the first time, and he silently rearranged them without pointing out what she'd done. She tried to help carry firewood in from the shed and misjudged the weight of the load, scattering split birch across the porch. She scrambled to gather it, her face hot despite the cold. "Leave it," Hayes said. He picked up the scattered wood in 2 armloads without comment and stacked it himself. No sigh, no look, just the work. Done. She stood on the porch, feeling useless and raw, and watched him go back inside. The afternoon went quiet. The snow refused to stop. Hayes worked at his table, carving, then mending a piece of harness leather, then sharpening a set of blades on a whetstone, each task carrying the same focused, patient attention. Josie sat by the stove with nothing to do, which was the worst kind of situation for her. Nothing to do meant her brain had time to move to things she'd been keeping ahead of for the last 3 months. She started at the sound of her own voice. She hadn't meant to speak. Hayes looked up from the whetstone. "Sorry," Josie said. "I didn't mean to." She stopped. I'm not good with quiet." Hayes looked at her for a moment. What kind of quiet? It was an odd question. She turned it over. "The kind where there's nothing to fix," she said finally. He held her gaze for another second, then looked back at the blade in his hand. He ran the edge slowly along the stone. "Quiet's not the thing that needs fixing," he said. She wanted to argue with that. She had been arguing with that, in one form or another, for the better part of 3 years. Instead, she looked at the stove and said nothing, and the sound of the stone against steel filled the room, and outside the snow came down without slowing. On the second morning, she woke up wrong. It crept in the way it always did. First as a stiffness in her lower back that spread upward, and then as a heat that wasn't the stove's doing. She lay in the loft, telling herself it was nothing. By the time she came downstairs, she knew it wasn't nothing. Her legs felt wrong. Her skin felt too tight. The simple act of lowering herself onto the bench sent a dizzy pulse behind her eyes that she had to breathe through. Hayes was outside. She could hear him on the roof. The sound of him clearing the snow load from the eaves with a long-handled rake. Steady passes back and forth. She sat by the stove and tried to hold herself upright and thought very clearly, "Do not be sick in this man's house." She was sick in this man's house. By noon she was on the bench with the wool blanket pulled around her shoulders, shivering hard enough that the bench creaked. She hadn't eaten. The thought of food was impossible. When Hayes came in from his second trip to the woodshed and found her like that, he stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the situation without speaking. He put his hand on her forehead. It was brief and completely impersonal. The back of his hand, rough from work, cool from outside, he took it away. "Loft," he said. "I don't need to. You're going to fall off that bench." He wasn't unkind. He was just accurate. Loft. She made it up the stairs on her own, which felt important. He followed with a tin cup of something that smelled medicinal and sharp, and a second wool blanket that he dropped over her without fanfare. "Elderberry and yarrow," he said. nodding at the cup. "It's bitter. Drink it anyway." It was profoundly bitter. She drank it anyway. He left her there, and she slept, badly, moving in and out of the particular misery of fever dreams. The kind where the images didn't connect to each other, and you couldn't tell if you were hot or cold because you were both at once, cycling back and forth every few minutes. At some point in what she thought was the late afternoon, she surfaced enough to feel the cold cloth on her forehead and understand that someone had put it there. Hayes was sitting on the wooden crate he'd pulled up to the side of the cot. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the small window at the end of the loft, where the light had gone grey and flat. He had a cup of water and the cloth, which he dipped and wrung out with the patient rhythm of someone who had sat with sick things before. She moved, trying to pull the blanket higher, and the wool slipped and the collar of her shirt fell open at the neck. She felt the air on her collarbone and reached to pull it closed. Hayes's hand stopped. She felt the stillness before she saw his face. She looked up at him. He was looking at her throat, or rather, at the right side of her throat where the bruising had settled deepest. It was 3 weeks old now, faded from the original purple-black to a sickly yellow-green, but in the loft's pale light it was still unmistakable. A hand span, thumb on one side, fingers on the other. She yanked the collar closed. Hayes didn't react. His face didn't change. He dipped the cloth back into the water, wrung it carefully, and pressed it to her forehead. "Sleep," he said. "Quiet. Final. The way you'd say it to someone you intended to keep safe through the night." She turned her face to the wall and let the tears go, silently, into the pillow. Not from shame exactly. Not from fear. From the exhaustion of having been seen. The fever broke overnight. She knew it was gone before she fully woke, the way you know. The sheets cool instead of clammy, the air in her lungs arriving in full measures instead of shallow sips. She's still in the grey morning, listening to the sounds of the cabin below. The storm was gone, she could tell by the quality of the quiet. The absence of the wind's pressure against the logs, the sharp, clean smell of post-storm cold coming through the chinking. Downstairs, Hayes was at the stove. She came down and he handed her a cup of real tea this time, and a bowl of oatmeal with a pour of maple syrup swirled across the top, and she sat at the table and ate all of it without speaking. He sat across from her, which he hadn't done before. He'd always stood or turned away. This morning he sat and drank his coffee and looked at the window. She'd been putting the story together in the back of her mind for 2 days without intending to. She'd been deciding whether it was hers to tell. "His name was Derek," she said. Hayes held his coffee cup in both hands. He didn't look at her. "We were together for 4 years, lived together for 3. She kept her own eyes on the table. It was easier. He wasn't always bad. I want to be clear about that because it matters somehow, I think, for people to understand it wasn't always bad." She turned the mug in her hands. The last year was different. The last year he was afraid of money, of his brother's opinion, of me leaving, I think, even though he was the one making me want to go. And afraid people turned into something I didn't know how to deal with. The kitchen was very quiet. I left in August. Properly. Packed while he was at work, took what was actually mine. She paused. "He found me at my friend's place in September. We had a conversation. That's what he called it, a conversation." Her fingers moved briefly to her throat, stopped. "I drove north because I didn't have a plan, just direction, just away." Hayes set his mug down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Man who corners something out of fear," he said, "isn't going after the thing. He's going after the feeling of being in control of it." He was quiet for a beat. "That's got nothing to do with you." It was a simple statement, not comfort. Exactly. More like something true being said plainly because it was true. Josie felt it move through her the way a real thing does. Not fast, but deep. "Is he the kind that looks?" Hayes asked. She considered it honestly. "He has the money for it." Hayes nodded slowly. He got up, carried both their cups to the basin, and stood there a moment with his hands braced on the counter. Outside, the snow in the clearing was blinding and unbroken, the surface undisturbed all the way to the tree line. "Road in here's a fire road," Hayes said. "Town road crew doesn't maintain it past the trailhead." He looked out the window. "Nobody gets up this track without a reason, and nobody finds a reason, unless they already know where to look. Won't be able to find that out until spring permits open in the county office." He turned around. "And that's assuming they know what county you're in." He didn't say it like a guarantee. He said it like a man reading geography. Flat, factual, certain. She breathed. The days after the storm had a different texture. Josie stopped being careful about where she stood in the kitchen. She learned the weight of the cast iron pot, and how to set it on the stove grate without the clang that had made her cringe the first day. She learned that Hayes fed the stove at 5 in the morning, and again at 10 at night, and that in between he expected it to be left alone to do its work. She learned that he went to the shed before coming inside. Always. Checked on the 2 horses and the small flock of hens that lived in the lean-to behind the woodpile before he shed his coat. Always the animals first, then himself. It was so consistent it seemed like a rule rather than a habit, and she filed it away as a thing that told her something real about him. She started cooking in the evenings. He didn't ask her to. She started because she needed something to do with her hands, and the cook stove was there, and she was getting her appetite back. She made bannock from the flour and baking powder she found on the shelf, badly the first time and less badly the second. She made a soup from the canned goods, and the dried herbs hanging above the window, and a handful of the rice from the bag in the corner. Hayes ate what she made without comment, which she came to understand was a form of approval. On the 4th day, the sun came out. Hard and low and blazing off the snow, turning the clearing into something that required squinting. Hayes spent most of it on the roof of the woodshed, clearing the remaining load that had accumulated during the storm. Josie brought him coffee mid-morning, which required finding the thermos on the high shelf and figuring out the temperament of the cook stove's heat without burning the coffee. She set it on the porch railing where he could reach it when he came down. He came down, poured a cup, drank half of it, standing on the porch steps looking at the tree line. Said nothing. Went back up. Later, when she was washing out the thermos, she heard him outside talking to the horses in a low, even murmur. She couldn't make out the words. It wasn't meant to carry that far. It was just the tone of it. The same voice he used inside, she realized. The same register, the same unhurried patience. He talked to the horses the way he talked to her, like neither of them needed performing at. On the 5th morning, he came in from the woodshed and didn't take his coat off. He stood by the door, turning his work gloves over in his hands. "Road's clear," he said. "Town'll have the main through by noon." Josie set down the coffee she'd been pouring. She looked at the back of her hands. "Right. Tow truck out of Kapuskasing can probably get to your car today if you call before 9. He moved to the table, laid his gloves down flat. "Diner's open Tuesdays. Woman who runs it can let you use the landline." "Okay." Josie folded the dish towel she was holding into a smaller and smaller square. "What do I owe you?" Hayes looked at her. "For the food," she said. For the nights." She forced herself to look up. "I've only got $14, but I can send the rest when Josie." He said it without volume. Just her name. She stopped. He looked at the table, the way he did when he was working something out and didn't want to be watched doing it. He pulled out the chair across from her side of the table and sat down, which he only ever did at mealtimes. "The horses need exercising through the winter," he said to the table. "2 of them. Takes about an hour each if you do it properly, twice a week." He picked up his gloves and set them back down. "I don't always have the time." He looked up. "I'm not saying I can't manage. I'm saying there's work here that wants doing, and I've been doing it alone for 6 years and I don't." He stopped. Started again. "I don't mind not being alone, if it's you." It was not a speech. It didn't rise and fall. It had no poetry in it. It was a practical man saying a precise and vulnerable thing as plainly as he was capable of, and the plainness of it was the thing that undid her. Josie set the dish towel on the counter. She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know how to exercise horses properly," she said. "I know." The corner of his mouth shifted. "I'd have to show you." She looked around the cabin, the stove, the shelves, the topographic map, the amber photograph, the carving tools laid in their careful row on the workbench, the wood smoke and coffee and cedar smell of the place that had gotten into her jacket so thoroughly she'd stopped noticing it. "And the horses need it twice a week," she said. "Minimum," Hayes said. Through to April. April was 6 months away. "All right," Josie said. Hayes nodded. Once, the way he did when something had been settled. He picked up his gloves and stood, moving toward the door. He pulled his coat from the peg. "Stove'll need wood," he said, stepping out onto the porch. "Stacks on the left. The birch burns cleaner." The door closed. Outside in the clearing, she heard him cross the snow to the lean-to, heard the low murmur of his voice as he went in to see the horses, telling them something. Starting the morning. Josie turned to the stove, picked up the iron handle, and opened the firebox. She looked at the glowing coals inside. She reached for the birch from the stack by the door and fed the fire, and the sparks flew up and the warmth held, and somewhere